Good afternoon. Again, whether you're here this whole time or you're tuning in just now or you came in a little bit late, our service today was scheduled to be Rest as Resistance. And all of the music we've heard has been selected by Darnell and Reverend Peggy to invite us into an awareness that rest in the world as it is, and to act from there. I'll begin with the words she selected from Thich Nhat Hanh. The miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is a walk on the green earth, dwelling deeply in the present moment and feeling truly alive. Walk as if you are kissing the earth with your feet. And I'm going to tell this now in my words. A few years ago, we took a trip down to DC. This was before the pandemic. It was a freer time. Unicorns were running down the street. Everyone was happy. For folks with smartphones, it was the year that Pokemon Go went live. And half the country was meandering about trying to catch all the electronic critters out on the streets. I wound up using it to find all sorts of historic sites in DC that I never would have run into otherwise. And I have gone to DC so many times in my life. It was silly, but it was new eyes. Anyway, while I was hoofing it around the streets of DC during the day, my husband had a nonprofit work conference to attend. Back then, he was working in cancer research. I was just there to tag along. While he was in workshops, in addition to my pokey hunts, I also was visiting our national museums and the National Zoo. We only got to see 3 museums together since he was in meetings all day. The Air and Space Museum, the American History Museum, and the National Zoo. If you've been to any of these, keep them in your mind. There were some awesome exhibits. There were some really great ones. And there were some extreme disappointments. The IMAX movie about gophers would have been a better and more riveting choice than watching the summer blockbuster, Independence Day 2. Not even in the IMAX International's capital could save that Rotten Tomato. And I wanted to show him the Star Trek Enterprise that I remember hanging from the ceiling as a kid. And even in my 20s, I still remember it there. But sadly, it was smaller than I recalled and tucked away in a corner. But my husband is an Air Force brat, born on one of our bases in Germany. So getting to see the history of air flight and much around our armed forces was still rather amazing to both of us. I'm a kid of Navy, but I was not born on a base. So I'm not a brat, officially. My husband is a brat. Okay. You got all that down? Okay, good. But the American History Museum was my prime goal. I used to visit the Smithsonian twice a year throughout most of my 20s. And in my college years, in addition to religion, I studied anthropology and archaeology and world art history. I couldn't get enough of seeing the things I read about in person, though. But contrary to all that, the most engaging exhibit in my memory was a section on TV history. Cultural relics from the small screen ensconced behind glass for the generations. Maybe it didn't make a lot of sense, but Archie Bunker's and Edith's chairs, Kermit the Frog, the ruby slipper from the Wizard of Oz, all of these small pieces of culture stood out as amazing to me when I finally got to see them in person when I was younger. I remember visiting it over 20 years ago, maybe 30 years now. And the exhibit circled around and around. I remember going through it, up escalators. And I think it took like 3 hours in my memory if you took the time to read everything. But this summer, in the year of the pokey hunts, right, we get to the museum and the whole layout is different. Everything looks more polished, but I don't recognize much of what I'm seeing. Beyond maybe the steam engine on the one floor, good museums change their exhibits regularly, so there's not an issue there. It's the way life is, it's the way they work. But soon we're circling and circling, and I cannot find the TV history section. We ask guides, and I'm starting to think we're in the wrong museum, that maybe there was a museum entirely dedicated to TV and radio. But one more guide insists that that's not the case and points us in another direction. We double back 3 times before Brian spies the ruby silver. It's just not the same. There's a lot less there from what I recall. The lighting is dim, and all the relics from that era can fit in a room that's maybe only the size of a typical congregation's social hall. This isn't a 3-hour exhibit. It's more like 15 minutes. We never found Kermit, though Edith and Archie's chairs were there, and there was the ruby slippers. It felt a little ironic that I was pining for a time when our yesteryear relics shined a bit more than they do now. How we remember how things once were has less glamour than it once did. Or maybe it's just me that's changed, or maybe it's just us that's changed. I know it has more to do with the reality that as time rolls on, the shows that I remember from my childhood, even if some of them were already in repeats, may not even be known by the generation that came after me. I think I saw every episode of Lassie, the dog. It's a show about a dog, 3 times in my childhood. And I grew up 20 years after the show came out, maybe 30. And Lassie's been out of syndication for 30 years. So the generation after me may not even know that it's a dog. Like I grew up and I kind of knew Howdy Doody had peanuts somewhere, but I don't remember anything else about the show because it was before my time. It's ended its syndication in the 90s somewhere. Time rolls on, but it struck me at a time in our nation's life where many of us are pining for nostalgia or easier days. All too often, things feel like we've gone off the rails. Losing the silly relics from yesteryear felt more like a punch in the gut than maybe was all that rational. We put some attachment into that. The wrestling with nostalgia can be counterproductive or even sometimes misleading. Shows change, cultural reference points change. That doesn't mean we're quite worse off, just that history is making room for those that come after us. Where do we find grounding in times of crisis? How do we find connection in an era that feels like we're further apart than ever? Where does upheaval help us to find our footing again? So I talked 2 weeks ago about what it would mean to be a people of summer. And for those that missed it, this is the 15-second recap. There will be no tests later. It's been my favorite season for almost 30 years until the last couple of years, where it's been 95 degrees every day for most of the summer. And I would look forward to it for much of the year, and then in a blink, half of it's gone away. I recalled from this pulpit about childhood summer days that seem to stretch on to eternity. And as the years go by and we get older, finding those never-ending days in the summer sun feels more and more elusive. And I don't mean here whether you can get the time off or the time away, even on long days at the beach as we age. I think time spreading out seems more elusive than in yesteryears in some way. We're so often more a people of nostalgia than a people of summer. Living into what was as some mythic time of ease and perfection in our minds, right? Rather than living in the day that is before us as it is, and which we should rejoice and be glad in it. We often hear folks lamenting how things once were and why we can't go back to that. And I want to pause here because it is too easy to think I'm talking about the current political partisan logos, but they're both kind of doing that right now. One side is nostalgia for Depression-era economics and isolationism that would lead into fascism, and another side is saying we don't want to lose what we've gained the last 60 years. And I think it's 60 years. I got a memory yesterday of when I was at the 50th anniversary of the Great March in Washington. It popped up yesterday, so I think this is 60 years. I'm not talking about that. Although some of what I'm talking about may inform how you understand that, that's for you to sort out and research. That's nostalgia speaking, lamenting about how things once were and that we can't go back to that. Things aren't worse these days, and bear with me as I talk through this, okay? We're just hearing and seeing more of what has always happened. Through the advent of cell phones and cameras in every hand and Twitter poking national media's attention. I watched when Biden made the announcement, I watched live news figure it out by Twitter informing them that it was ahead of the national media. With all the instant access news, it feels like things are way much worse than they once were. And they're very much, some things can be horrific. Things are horrific. And we're seeing genocide in our world now, and rights are factually being taken away, have been taken away, and some more will go if we're not careful. And we're not the first generation to be forced to utter that sentence. Our grandparents could say the same thing that I just said, and their grandparents could say the same thing that I just said, all the way back. And I don't say that lightly. I find horror in that truth, and I find hope. Every loss is tragic. That's the truth. And we're not getting worse. We're getting much better. But that's not how we feel. We feel like it's worse. There's a way in which that's real for some people, right? For some of us, there are in our lives, some things are getting worse, especially as anyone who has lost a loved one or fears the loss of a loved one. I'm dealing with my aging parents, cancer diagnoses, and so I don't say this lightly. I find hope in the fact that our grandparents' generation and their grandparents' generation, and all the way back, rose as best they could to the occasion in their time. And I have faith that we will do our ancestors proud. And that gives me hope. We've done this before, and we've done it before, and we've done it before, and it's to us now. And resting in nostalgia is a kind of a false reset. It's like in the fairy tales where the hero makes the mistake of eating the sweet nectar of dreamland and falls asleep for another 100 years. That kind of nostalgia makes it harder for us to do the work we need to do in order to make it better for those who are serving and living today in this world. We can't fix something that's broken if we don't address it as it is, as it really is, and not as we think it is, or we remember it was through rose-colored glassism. Rose-colored glasses, not glassism, although that might be a thing. And in Buddhism, this is what that is saying. It is be present to the moment as it is, and then act from that moment. Communities of color have had to face this reality, of course, since the first days in our nation whether they were born here, immigrated here, forcibly taken here, or were kicked off their own land. That wasn't better. Waves of white immigrants have experienced challenges like unwelcome signs, housing and employment bias, and so on. But within a few generations, white immigrant families integrate and dodge the bias by being known as white rather than Italian or German or Irish. Those days weren't better. Beyond us simply being more aware of the violence on our streets because of cell phone cameras and Facebook poking the attention of newscasters faster than they can follow on their own. And sometimes we're led by our noses by troll farms coming from Russia or China or Iran to get us all mixed up and arguing with each other in our own nation. But all of that, especially the troll farms, can create a sense among white communities across our country that somehow whiteness is under attack, or that somehow women are under attack by people's expression of their own gender identity. For a long time, I mostly saw it as pains associated with having some of your privilege taken away and confusing that with oppression, right? I mean, there is that kind of thing going on. But a New Yorker article of some summers ago had an interesting story about the advent in popular culture of putting real and mocking faces on what we derogatorily call white trash and compare that to proper elite whites. And I think this is the dangerous part of nostalgia in our country right here, right now. Urban centers are taken seriously, rural communities are taken as a joke. Enough decades of that, and we have a problem in our national identity. If whites in urban centers advance and whites in rural centers stagnate, that sense of loss gets worse. Maybe we're starting to see that in some parts of our suburbs as well. And when we live into our identity of a people of nostalgia, we remember back to all the black and white TV classics where middle America seemed to be the best of us. We want to go back to how things were then, with a vibrant middle class, a one-family income, and no cell phone cameras showing us where the fire hoses and the shootings and the beatings are happening in real time. Those days weren't better. From the fire hoses that led to Selma to any story we hear about daily in our news feeds today, they've been there all along. Now we're just talking about it more. Or maybe I should say, all of us now are talking about it more, because communities that have lived through oppression have always talked about it. When we live into being a people of summer, we don't stick with the notion that the days only stretched out into eternity when we are children. That's a trick of our monkey mind. We're letting the part of ourselves that are weighed down with responsibilities and obligations to rule our downtime even when we don't have those obligations. Anyone here ever work a job and when you're done for the day, you're still thinking about the job? And that argument you had with that person, you know the person, right? And then that's our life then. We're in the constant obligation mode. And our days become shorter and more fret with anxiety. It's a classic trap we've all done. Sunday comes along and you lament that you have to go back to work on Monday, so much that you lose much of the joy of the day off because we're already living into our next work day. And there was no generation of humanity where the wider world was as easy and safe as we may or may not have imagined it as a child, our own childhood. And as we age and see the world without the safety guards our parents or caregivers hopefully gave us, we become overwhelmed the more informed we are. The greater awareness that hopefully comes with maturity doesn't mean that the world was ever easier. It does mean, though, it's in our hands now. The world as it is, in its hardships and its splendors, for all the hate in the world, and there is much hate, I see much more love. Rootedness is a spiritual discipline. Being rooted in what's right before us, for good or for bad, is the most spiritual way to live. When we work, we work. When we rest, though, we get to rest. And that's true in our questing for justice times, as well as our daily living. Nostalgia for what was, even knowing in all likelihood, it never really was like that way. We like to remember it. Only keeps us from rejoicing and being glad in every new day and doing what must be done. I'll close this sermon with how we began the service, Tit Nan Han. The miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is a walk on the green earth, dwelling deeply in the present moment and feeling truly alive. Walk as if you're kissing the earth with your feet. Amen and blessed be.